She could not read a single word. Yet she raised the boy who would become Abraham Lincoln, the man whose words would hold a breaking nation together. She gave him everything: a floor, a book, a name. And at their last goodbye, she told him to his face that his enemies would kill him. He smiled and said she was wrong. She was not wrong. Tonight, the story of the illiterate widow who made a president, foresaw his murder, and was buried in the black dress he left her. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Behind the Throne. In the spring of 1869, in a country churchyard on the Illinois prairie, an old woman was laid to rest in a plain black dress. There was nothing remarkable about the dress. It was wool, simple, the kind a frontier widow might wear to church. But this one had been a gift, given to her years before, by a tall man who stooped to embrace her on a winter morning and called her Mother. By some accounts, it was the dress she had chosen for this very day. She had kept it and waited. The man who gave it to her was Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States. And the woman in the black dress was not his mother, not by blood. Her name was Sarah Bush Johnston. She came into Lincoln's life when he was 10 years old, a motherless boy on a dirt floor in the Indiana wilderness, ragged, half-wild, and already acquainted with grief. She arrived a poor widow with debts and 3 children of her own. She could not read. She could not write her own name. And yet, of all the people who would shape the boy who became Lincoln, the teachers, the lawyers, the generals, the statesmen, it was this illiterate frontier woman who taught him to love the written word. Years later, when an old law partner came asking what she remembered, she tried to explain the bond between them. "His mind and mine," she said, "what little I had, seemed to run together, move in the same channel." Tonight, we are not telling the story of the president. We have told that story many times in this very series: his wife, his sons, the woman who dressed them. Tonight, we step further back to the very beginning, before the speeches, before the war, before the marble and the memorials. We go back to a one-room cabin and a woman history has very nearly forgotten. Because this is a story about what greatness costs the people who make it possible. It is the story of a woman who gave a boy everything she had, and then watched the world take him for its own. It is the story of a mother who feared, long before anyone else, exactly how her son would die, and who lived, in the end, to be proven right. The history books remember Abraham Lincoln. They have little room for Sarah. But she was there at the start of him, and she was still living, alone on the prairie, when the news came from Washington. Our story begins on a December day in 1819, in a Kentucky log house, where a widower with 2 hungry children came to call on a widow he had known long ago. He did not come with flowers, or with soft words, or with any of the gentleness that a courtship is supposed to require. Thomas Lincoln had no gift for such things. He had buried his wife 14 months before, and he had 2 children growing wilder by the season in a cabin in the Indiana woods. What he needed was a wife. What those children needed was a mother. And so, in December of 1819, he rode back to Elizabethtown, Kentucky, to a woman he had known years earlier, now a widow, like he was a widower. Her name was Sarah Bush Johnston. As the story would later be told, Thomas wasted no time at her door. "I have no wife, and you no husband," he is said to have told her. "I came a purpose to marry you. I knowed you from a gal, and you knowed me from a boy. I've no time to lose, and if you're willin', let it be done straight off." It was not romance. It was an offer made between two people who had each already lost a great deal. Sarah knew loss. She had been born in the Kentucky backcountry in 1788, the daughter of a landowning family. She had married a man named Daniel Johnston and borne him 3 children. And in 1816, when a cholera epidemic swept through their county, Daniel had died, leaving Sarah a widow in her 20s, with 3 small children and a pile of debts she had no way to pay. So, when Thomas Lincoln stood at her door with his blunt proposal, she did not refuse him. She told him only that she could not marry until her debts were settled. Thomas paid them that same day. The next, they were married. She did not yet know the boy she was about to inherit, and she did not yet know what had been happening all those long months in the cabin she was about to enter. For more than a year, the 2 Lincoln children had been very nearly raising themselves. Their mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, had died of milk sickness in the autumn of 1818, and after she was gone, the household had simply come apart. Abraham was 9 when it happened. His sister Sarah was 11, far too young to keep a home the way a mother keeps it, however hard she tried. A teenaged cousin, Dennis Hanks, lived with them too, and through that long, motherless year, the 3 of them had drifted, unwashed, underfed, the cabin sinking slowly into squalor around them. When the wedding party crossed the Ohio and came at last to the Lincoln place at Little Pigeon Creek, what Sarah found there would have stopped a lesser woman at the threshold. By one account, the household goods she brought with her, feather beds, a walnut bureau, a spinning wheel, chairs, a table, filled a 4-horse wagon. They were modest things, but against what waited inside the Lincoln cabin, they were the furnishings of a palace. The cabin had no floor but packed earth, no proper door, no window worth the name, and in it lived 2 children who had been, for more than a year, very nearly fending for themselves. The boy was tall for his age and watchful, with a habit of saying little and missing nothing. Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln did not flinch. She set to work. She had Thomas lay a wooden floor over the bare ground. She had the roof patched and a real door hung. She had a window cut and covered with greased paper to let in the light, and a loft built above for the boys to sleep in. She cleaned the 2 Lincoln children, clothed them in something better than rags, and folded them in among her own 3, as though there had never been any difference between them. And, by every account that survives, she never once made a difference between them as long as she lived. Within weeks, it was a different household entirely. One observer remembered that she made the wild young Abraham look more human. But the floor and the roof were not the gift that mattered most. The gift that mattered most was harder to see, and it cost her something to give. Sarah Bush Johnston could not read. She could not write her own name. She had grown up on a frontier where a woman's letters were of no use to anyone, and no one had ever taught her. And yet she looked at this strange, bookish stepson of hers, a boy who would walk for miles to borrow a single volume, who read the same handful of books until he knew them by heart, and something in her understood him. There were not many books in that cabin. Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, Aesop's Fables, the Family Bible, A Borrowed Life of Washington. Reportedly, Sarah added what little she had of her own to the boys' small library. And when Thomas, who could barely read himself, and who saw in his son's reading nothing but chores left undone, wanted to put the boy back to work, it was Sarah who stood between them. She remembered it plainly, decades later. "Mr. Lincoln," she said of her husband, "never made Abe quit reading to do anything if he could avoid it. He would do it himself first." It is a small sentence, but inside it is the whole future of a nation. A man who could not understand his son, a wife who could not read a word, And between them, by the firelight, a boy bent over a book, left alone for one more hour to become the person he was going to be. "Abe was the best boy I ever saw," she would say of him, when there was no one left to flatter and nothing left to gain by saying it. "He never gave me a cross word or look." She had walked into that cabin a stranger. She could not read the books the boy loved. She could not have told you what greatness was or how to recognize it. But she had recognized it anyway, and she had defended it. She did not know, she could not have known, that the quiet boy she was raising would one day stand at the center of the most terrible storm the country had ever seen. She only knew that he was hers now, and she meant to keep him. She meant to keep him. And for a while, for the better part of a decade, she did. The years that followed were the closest thing to a true childhood that Abraham Lincoln would ever have. They were not easy years. The work was hard, the land was poor, and the cabin at Little Pigeon Creek was never more than a few bad seasons from ruin. But under Sarah's roof, the boy was allowed to become himself, and the self he became bore her fingerprints everywhere. He grew, that boy, grew alarmingly. By the time he was in his late teens, he stood nearly 6'4", all elbows and knees, his head very nearly brushing the ceiling of the cabin kitchen. Sarah used to tease him about it. She would warn him, laughing, that if he didn't keep his hair clean, he'd leave marks on her ceiling. One day, as the story was later told, Lincoln decided to take her at her word. While she was away from the house, he gathered a group of small children, walked them out to the muddy yard, and had them wet their bare feet in the mud. Then he carried them inside one by one, turned them upside down, and walked their muddy feet across her clean, whitewashed ceiling. When Sarah came home to find a ceiling covered in tiny footprints, she did not scold him. She laughed and threatened to spank him. It is a small thing, a domestic joke across 2 centuries, but it tells you what kind of home she had built. A home where a poor, awkward, motherless boy could be playful, could be loved, could be, for a few years, simply a child. The other thing she gave him was harder to measure, and it would outlast everything. Those who knew them both came to believe that Lincoln's famous wit, the storytelling, the timing, the gift for disarming a hostile room with a single homely joke, was in no small part hers. She was, by every account, a woman who loved to laugh, firm but warm, quick with a story of her own. The man who would one day hold a grieving cabinet together with a folksy parable had learned, in part, at her kitchen table how it was done. And there was the matter of his honesty, the quality that would one day be carved into his very name. When Sarah spoke of it years afterward, she did not reach for grand words. She simply said what she had seen. "He never told me a lie in his life," she remembered. "Never evaded, never equivocated, never dodged." Honest Abe, the country would call him, as though it were a campaign slogan. But the woman who raised him knew it was something older and quieter than that, a thing she had watched take root in a boy by firelight, in a cabin where there was nothing to be gained by lying, and no one to lie to. She gave him a floor to stand on, and books to read, and a character to carry. She gave him, in short, everything she had. And everything she gave him was preparing him to leave. That is the cruelty hidden inside good parenting, and Sarah would taste it fully. The reading she defended did not bind him closer to the cabin. It opened a door in the far wall of it, a door that led out, to law and politics, and a life she could not follow. The very gifts that made him hers were the gifts that would carry him away. In 1830, the family pulled up stakes and moved west again, this time into Illinois. And in the spring of the following year, Abraham, newly 22, and by frontier custom a man free to make his own way, left his father's household for good. He went to a little river town called New Salem, and from there into the wider world. He would never again live under the same roof as the woman who raised him. After that, he came when he could. By her own count, she saw him every year or two. He would arrive on the circuit, a country lawyer riding from courthouse to courthouse, and stop to sit with her a while, and then he would ride on. She did not begrudge him this. She was proud of him, fiercely, quietly proud. But pride is a cold thing to keep a house warm with. The boy who had filled her kitchen with mud and laughter was becoming a man the whole state was beginning to talk about. The reading she had fought for was making him into someone the world would want. And the world, when it wanted him, would not ask her permission. The world did not ask her permission. It rarely does with the mothers of great men. Through the 1830s and into the 1840s, Abraham Lincoln climbed. He learned the law. He won a seat in the Illinois legislature, and then another. He married a banker's daughter from Kentucky named Mary Todd, and built a comfortable house in Springfield, and began to move in circles that a woman from a dirt-floor cabin could scarcely imagine. Each step carried him further up, and each step carried him further away. Sarah remained where she had always been, on the land, in Coles County, in a small farmhouse on the Illinois prairie. The visits, which had never been frequent, grew rarer still. A year would pass, sometimes two, and in the spaces between, the only thread that ran between the cabin and the rising man in Springfield was the occasional letter, carried by hand, read aloud to her by someone else, because she still could not read a word of it herself. There is a particular ache in that image. A woman who had given a boy the gift of reading, sitting in her old age while a neighbor read her his words. The very thing she had fought for had become the wall between them. And then, in the winter of 1851, the family received word that Thomas Lincoln was dying. What happened next has troubled biographers for 150 years. Abraham Lincoln, the rising lawyer, the devoted correspondent, the man who would one day be called the conscience of a nation, did not go to his father's deathbed. He sat in Springfield and he wrote a letter instead. It went to his stepbrother, John Johnston, Sarah's son, who was nursing the dying man. "I sincerely hope father may yet recover his health," Lincoln wrote. But he would not come. His own wife was unwell, he explained. His business could not be left. And then, in a passage that has never quite stopped echoing, he wrote of his father, "Say to him that if we could meet now, it is doubtful whether it would not be more painful than pleasant. If we could meet now, it would be more painful than pleasant." Thomas Lincoln died a week later. His son did not attend the funeral. We do not know everything that lay between that father and that son. The years of hard labor demanded, the reading dismissed as idleness, the distance that had opened so early and never closed. But we know this: when Thomas Lincoln went into the ground, in an unmarked grave on the Illinois prairie, the most famous son in the state was not there to see it. And here is the thing that makes Sarah's story what it is. Because the very same man, the son who would not cross the county to bury his own father, did not for one moment let go of her. When Thomas died, the land the old couple had lived on came into question, and Lincoln, quietly, made an arrangement. He kept 40 acres of that farm in his own name, not for himself, not to sell, but, in his own words, for mother while she lives. He would carry it on his books and see that she was never turned off it for as long as she drew breath. He could not, or would not, reconcile with the father, but the stepmother he kept. The 40 acres were his way of saying what he could not bring himself to say to Thomas, that whatever else had broken in that family, this bond had not. She understood what it meant. She had always understood him better than anyone. The boy whose mind had run in the same channel as her own did not need to write the words, "I love you," for her to hear them. He wrote them in 40 acres of prairie. He wrote them every time he rode out of his way, on the circuit, to sit an afternoon with her. He wrote them in the way he still, at 50, called her mother. But there is a loneliness in being loved from a distance, in being provided for and protected and visited once in a long while, and otherwise left to the quiet of an empty farmhouse, listening for a horse on the road that did not often come. Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln had given a boy everything, and in return, she had been given 40 acres and a name, Mother, and the slow, aching privilege of watching from very far away as the whole country began to want her son for its own. She was an old woman now. She had buried 2 husbands. She had outlived more than she cared to count. And she had begun to fear, with the strange clarity that sometimes comes to the old, that she was not yet finished burying the people she loved. In the autumn of 1860, the country chose Abraham Lincoln to be its 16th president, and on the prairie, his stepmother was not glad. She was afraid. She was afraid, and she made no secret of it. In the weeks after the election, while the rest of the country argued over what Lincoln's victory would mean, a letter made its way to Springfield from Coles County. It came from a relative, and it carried a message about the old woman on the prairie. She was, the letter said, getting somewhat childish and very uneasy about her stepson, fearing some of your political opponents will kill you. She was, it went on, very anxious to see you once more. Once more, as though she already knew there would not be many more. Lincoln read it, and amid the unimaginable weight of those weeks, a nation splitting apart beneath him, states declaring their departure one after another, the whole machinery of secession grinding into motion, the president-elect made a decision. Before he left Illinois for Washington, before he took up the burden that would consume him, he would go and say goodbye to his stepmother. It was not a simple journey. The farm sat far out on the prairie, and the trip took the better part of 2 days. He went at the end of January, 1861. He spent a night in the town of Charleston, and then rode the last miles south to a cabin belonging to one of Sarah's relations, where the old woman was waiting for him. We have only fragments of what passed between them that day, but the fragments are enough. He was 51 years old now, the most famous man in America, weeks away from the presidency. She was 72, bent and frail, her hair gone gray. He came through the door and folded his enormous frame down to embrace her, and for a little while they were simply what they had always been to each other, not a president and a pauper, but a mother and her boy. They spent the day together, and at some point in it, the two of them rode out across the cold fields to a small country graveyard, to stand together over the unmarked grave of Thomas Lincoln, the husband she had buried, the father he had not come home to bury. Whatever was said there, between the old widow and her famous stepson, at the grave of the man they had both, in their different ways, failed to fully reach, that history did not record. They stood a while in the cold, and then they turned back toward the warmth of the cabin, and toward the goodbye they both knew was coming. When the time came for him to go, Sarah could not let him leave without speaking the fear that had been growing in her for months. According to an account set down by one of her own relatives, she embraced him and told him plainly that she would never see him again, that she felt certain his enemies would assassinate him. And Lincoln, gentle as he always was with her, tried to soothe her. "No, no, Mama," he is said to have answered. He always called her Mama. "They will not do that. Trust in the Lord, and all will be well. We will see each other again. We will see each other again." It was the kind of thing you say to comfort a frightened old woman. It was the kind of thing a son says at a doorway, half believing it himself. And it was, as it turned out, the last thing she would ever hear him say. He climbed into the carriage. She stood in the cold and watched him go, down the long prairie road, back toward Charleston and the train and Washington and the war and everything that was waiting for him there. She had given him a floor to stand on, and books to read, and a name to live up to. She had given him 40 winters of a love he could not always find the words to return. And now, at the very end, she had given him the one thing he refused to take from her: the truth. She knew. Somehow, that frail and childish old woman out on the prairie knew what the generals and the cabinet secretaries and the whole apparatus of the United States government would fail to prevent. She had said it to his face, and he had told her, kindly, that she was wrong. She would not be wrong. 4 years would pass. 4 years of war, of casualty lists, of a son grown gaunt and gray under a weight no man should carry. 4 years in which she waited on the prairie, an old woman in a farmhouse, listening for news. And then, one April day in 1865, the news came. The news came the way the worst news always came to the prairie, slowly, by word of mouth, carried down the roads from somewhere far away. In Washington, it had already happened. On the night of April 14th, 1865, in a theater box draped with flags, a man had stepped behind the president and fired a single shot. By morning, Abraham Lincoln was dead. The war was barely over. The man who had carried the country through its darkest passage did not live to see the peace. And out on the Illinois prairie, in a farmhouse at Goose Nest Prairie, an old woman of 76 was about to learn that the thing she had feared for 4 years had finally come to pass. Here, the record splits in two, and the split itself tells us something. By one account, the one handed down by Dennis Hanks, the cousin who had grown up alongside Lincoln in that long-ago cabin, it was Hanks himself who brought her the news. He remembered it years later in the plain speech of the frontier. "Aunt Sarah," he said he told her, "Abe's dead." And he remembered her answer. "Yes, I know, Denny. I knowed they'd kill him. I been a-waitin' for it." She asked no questions, he said. She had been waiting for it. By another account, this one from John Hall, who was living with her at the farm, the moment was quieter and more terrible still. He remembered that when she understood what she had been told, she did not cry out or collapse. She simply put her apron over her face, and from behind it came her voice. "Oh, my boy Abe. They've killed him. I knew they would. I knew they would." 2 men, 2 memories, 2 slightly different sets of words. We cannot now say with certainty which of them carries the exact phrasing of what she said that day, or whether the truth lies somewhere between them. The historians have argued over it, but notice what the 2 accounts agree on. In both, there is no shock. In both, there is no disbelief, no desperate questioning, no "it cannot be." In both, there is only a kind of grim recognition, the sound of a fear arriving at last, after 4 long years of waiting at the door. She was not surprised. That is the thing that should stop us. The mother of a murdered president, hearing of his murder, and her first response is not, "How can this be?" but, "I knew. I knew they would. I have been waiting." She had stood at that doorway in 1861 and told him to his face that they would kill him. He had smiled and called her Mama and told her to trust in the Lord. And now, in 1865, The apron came up over her face, and the only thing left to say was that she had been right all along. There is no comfort in being right about a thing like that. There is only the long silence after. Hall remembered that she was never the same afterward. The brightness that had defined her, the woman who loved to laugh, who teased a 6'4" boy about her ceiling, who had filled a grim cabin with warmth, went out of her. She had survived 2 husbands. She had survived the frontier and poverty and the milk-sickness winters and the slow erosions of a long life. She had survived nearly everything a person could be asked to survive. But this was the one thing she had prayed she would not. A mother is not meant to outlive her son, and of all the sons in all the world to outlive, she had outlived this one. The boy off the dirt floor, the boy who left footprints on her ceiling, the boy whose mind had run in the same channel as her own. Somewhere in Washington, an entire nation was draping itself in black. The funeral train would carry his body 1,600 miles, and millions would stand along the tracks to watch it pass. There would be eulogies and monuments, and a grief so vast it had no edges. And out on the prairie, in a farmhouse far from all of it, there was only an old woman with an apron over her face, saying the same words over and over to the empty air. I knew they would. I knew they would. She had been the first to love him, and now she was among the last to mourn him. Not at the great state funeral, not in the marble halls, but alone, at a kitchen table, 4 years after she had warned him at a doorway and been told, gently, that she was wrong. She lived 4 more years. They were quiet years, and we know very little of them because there was almost no one left who thought to write them down. The boy she had raised was gone. The husbands were gone. The world that had wanted her son so badly had no particular use for the old woman who had made him. It had taken what it needed and moved on. But in the autumn of 1865, a few months after the assassination, a carriage came up the road to the farmhouse on the prairie. The man who stepped down was a lawyer from Springfield named William Herndon, Lincoln's old law partner. The whole country was in mourning, and Herndon had set himself a strange and lonely task. He meant to find everyone still living who had truly known Abraham Lincoln, and to write down what they remembered before it was lost forever. And so he came, at last, to Sarah. He found her frail, breathing with difficulty, very near the end of her own road. But when he began to ask her, gently, simply, about the boy she had raised half a century before, something came back into her. She talked. She told him about the cabin and the books and the reading she had defended. She told him that Abe had been the best boy she ever saw, that he never gave her a cross word, that he never told her a lie. And she reached for the thing that was hardest to say, the thing about how their 2 minds had seemed to move together in the same channel all those years ago. Almost everything we know about the young Abraham Lincoln, the boy before the history, before the legend, comes to us through that single afternoon. If Herndon had not made the journey, if he had not sat with her and listened, the woman who shaped Lincoln would have vanished from the record almost entirely. She very nearly did anyway. Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln died on the 12th of April, 1869, at the age of 80. They buried her on the prairie, near the husband whose grave she had visited with her stepson on that last cold day. And when they laid her in the ground, by the accounts that come down to us, she was wearing a plain black dress. the one Lincoln had given her years before at their final parting. She had kept it all that time. She had chosen it for this. Her grave went unmarked for more than 50 years. The most famous stepmother in American history, the woman who had taught a president to read, who had defended his right to a book by firelight, who had warned him of his death and been proven right, lay beneath the prairie grass with no stone to name her. It was not until 1924 that anyone thought to mark the spot. The history books remember Abraham Lincoln. His face is carved into a mountain and printed on the currency and set in marble in a temple on the Mall, where the people of the country he saved come to stand before him in silence. There is no temple for Sarah. There is a small stone on the prairie, raised half a century too late, and a black wool dress long since gone to dust, and a handful of plain sentences spoken to a lawyer one autumn afternoon, and very nearly lost. But she was there at the start of him, before the speeches and the war and the marble, before any of it. There was a poor, illiterate widow who walked into a cabin with a dirt floor, looked at a ragged, motherless boy, and decided he was worth saving. She could not read a word he ever wrote. She had simply known, before anyone else in the world, that the words would be worth keeping.